Pilot ignores black woman's medical emergency. Her husband's identity leaves the crew speechless. Have you ever faced a moment where someone's indifference or prejudice could cost a life? Imagine being 0 feet in the air, completely vulnerable, and the one person responsible for everyone's safety refuses to act. This is the story of Rachel Turner and her husband Daniel, a tale of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice that would send shockwaves through an entire industry. Rachel Turner, a successful entrepreneur, and Daniel, a respected doctor, had planned a quiet flight to London. But as they settled into their first-class seats, it became clear that this journey would be anything but ordinary. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, mingling with soft conversations and the clinking of glasses. Yet, beneath the polished facade of luxury, Rachel and Daniel could feel the weight of unspoken judgments. Rachel adjusted her seatbelt, trying to ignore the occasional sideways glances from other passengers. There were no words spoken, but she could feel the silent assumptions lingering in the air, a familiar burden she had carried for years. Seated beside her, Daniel, engrossed in a medical journal, offered quiet reassurance with his calm presence. But even his steady demeanor couldn't dispel the unease simmering inside her. Moments later, a flight attendant approached with a smile that felt overly practiced, like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. "Mrs. Turner, is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" the attendant asked. Rachel responded politely, "No, I'm fine, thank you." The attendant nodded, but not before casting a quick glance toward a colleague nearby. Their shared look was subtle but unmistakable, a silent exchange that Rachel had seen far too many times. Doubt, judgment, or worse. "Did you notice how they looked at us?" Rachel whispered to Daniel, her voice low but tinged with frustration. Without looking up, Daniel replied evenly, "I did. Let it go, Rachel. We're here because we deserve to be." His words were meant to comfort, but they couldn't erase the tension pressing down on Rachel. She had learned to navigate moments like this, where prejudice hid behind a thin veneer of civility. Yet as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard with an air of authority, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. What started as subtle discomfort would soon escalate into a life-or-death battle, one where Daniel's expertise, Rachel's resilience, and the passengers' quiet support would challenge the arrogance of those in charge. What unfolded next was a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, even in the most dire of circumstances. Stay tuned as we uncover how this ordinary flight turned into a fight for survival and accountability, a story that reminds us all of the importance of courage in the face of adversity. The flight seemed routine as the plane climbed steadily to its cruising altitude. Rachel Turner adjusted in her seat, trying to ignore the dull ache that had begun to creep into her chest. At first, she dismissed it as discomfort from sitting too long, or perhaps the lingering effects of travel fatigue. Beside her, Daniel Turner, her husband and a seasoned cardiologist, remained focused on the medical journal in his lap, his pen moving with precision as he took notes. Rachel shifted again, her unease growing. The ache in her chest wasn't going away. Instead, it was deepening, spreading like ripples in water. She glanced at Daniel, hesitant to disturb him. It wasn't unusual for her to experience minor aches during travel, but this time it felt different, heavier and more insistent. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tinged with worry, "I'm not feeling well." Now, Daniel immediately put down his journal, his calm demeanor replaced by quiet concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, placing a hand gently on hers. "It's my chest," Rachel said, rubbing the area absent-mindedly. "It's tight, and it's getting harder to breathe." Daniel's expression darkened. He was no stranger to symptoms like these. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Let me check your pulse." His fingers found her wrist, and his brows furrowed as he felt her rapid, shallow heartbeat. "This could be serious," he muttered, already in action mode. Turning to the nearest flight attendant, Daniel called out, "Excuse me, I need immediate assistance. My wife is experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath." The attendant, a young woman with a polite but practiced smile, blinked as if unsure how to process his words. "I'll need to consult with the captain," she said hesitantly. There's no time to consult, Daniel snapped, his calm facade cracking. She could be having a heart attack. Bring me the oxygen and the medical kit now. The attendant faltered, her professional composure slipping for a moment before she nodded and hurried off. Rachel's condition was worsening by the minute. Her breaths were coming in shallow gasps, and a sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. She clutched Daniel's hand tightly, her voice trembling. "It's getting harder, Daniel," she whispered. "I know," he replied, his voice cracking for the first time. "Just hold on. I'm here." Minutes passed like hours as Daniel kept a watchful eye on Rachel's symptoms, his medical training racing through his mind. Finally, the flight attendant returned, holding a small medical kit and an oxygen mask. Daniel wasted no time. He adjusted the mask over Rachel's face, ensuring it was secure, and monitored her breathing. But the kit was woefully inadequate, missing critical items Daniel knew could make a difference. "This isn't enough," he muttered under his breath. Turning to the attendant, he asked, "What's the captain's decision? We need to land as soon as possible." The attendant looked uncomfortable, shifting on her feet. "The captain has been informed, but he believes the situation doesn't warrant diverting the flight unless it's an absolute emergency. He's monitoring the situation from the cockpit." Daniel straightened, his tone ice cold. "Monitoring the situation? Does he have a medical degree? Because I do. This is an emergency, and every moment we delay puts her life at greater risk." The murmurs of other passengers filled the cabin as they began to take notice of the growing tension. A few exchanged worried glances, while others whispered among themselves. One man in a neighboring seat muttered under his breath, "This is first class. They should know how to handle this." But Daniel's focus remained solely on Rachel. Her complexion had turned ashen, and her fingers trembled as they gripped his hand. The oxygen mask wasn't enough. She needed a hospital, and she needed it fast. "Tell the captain this is a life-threatening emergency," Daniel said to the attendant, his voice resolute. "If he doesn't act, he'll be explaining to the airline why he let a passenger die on his watch." 7 days later, the attendant's face paled, and she hurried off once more. Daniel turned back to Rachel, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "You're going to be okay, Rachel," he said, his voice both a promise and a plea. "I won't let anything happen to you." As the minutes dragged on, Daniel's frustration mounted. The indifference of the crew was infuriating, but he couldn't let it distract him. Rachel needed him to stay strong. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. If the captain wouldn't act, he would have to find another way to save her. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Daniel Turner, his wife Rachel's life slipping through his fingers, waited for action. He glanced at the medical kit, still woefully inadequate for the emergency at hand. His frustration boiled over, every passing second feeling like a cruel countdown. Rachel's breathing was shallow, her complexion ashen, and despite the oxygen mask, her condition was not stabilizing. Daniel knew the odds were stacking against her. The flight attendant returned, her face pale. "The captain insists we're following standard protocol," she said hesitantly, avoiding Daniel's piercing gaze. "He's monitoring the situation from the cockpit." Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice low and filled with controlled fury. "Monitoring the situation? My wife is dying right in front of me, and your captain's solution is to sit in the cockpit and wait? I need this plane on the ground now." A collective hush swept over the cabin as passengers turned to watch the confrontation. Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd, and a few passengers leaned forward in their seats, their expressions a mixture of unease and sympathy. "Sir," the flight attendant began, her professionalism faltering under the weight of Daniel's intensity, "the captain has to consider the safety of all passengers. Diverting the flight isn't a decision made lightly." Daniel rose to his full height, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. "I am a doctor with over 20 years of experience in emergency medicine. I don't take this lightly either. What I see is a woman in cardiac distress who needs immediate medical intervention. If you don't act, she will die. Tell your captain that, and tell him I will hold him personally accountable." The murmurs grew louder. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman stood up, her expression resolute. "He's right. She's in serious trouble, and the captain needs to do something. We can't just sit here and watch this happen." Another passenger, a man in his 30s, nodded in agreement. She's clearly not okay. If he's a doctor and says this is serious, we need to land the plane. Encouraged by the passenger's support, Daniel turned to the flight attendant again, his voice unwavering. You see, this isn't just me. Everyone here sees what's happening. Go back and tell the captain he doesn't have the luxury of ignoring this anymore. The flight attendant hurried off, her steps quick and uncertain. As she disappeared toward the cockpit, Daniel sat back down beside Rachel, gripping her hand tightly. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't breathe." "Stay with me, Rachel," Daniel said softly, his voice cracking. "I'm here. You're going to get through this. I promise." Minutes stretched into an eternity before the captain finally emerged from the cockpit. Captain Richard Harris, a tall man with a polished uniform and an air of practiced authority, strode down the aisle. His expression was controlled, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes as he approached Daniel. "Dr. Turner," Harris began, his tone clipped, "I've been informed of your concerns. Let me assure you, we're monitoring the situation closely." Daniel stood, his fury barely contained. "Monitoring the situation? My wife is dying in front of you, and you're standing here talking about monitoring? She needs a hospital, Captain, now." Harris's jaw tightened. "I understand your concern, but we cannot divert the plane unless it's absolutely necessary. This decision isn't made lightly." Daniel took a step closer, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the cabin. "It is absolutely necessary. She's showing clear signs of cardiac distress. If you don't act, you'll be explaining to the airline and to the world why you let a passenger die because you didn't want to inconvenience yourself." The passengers erupted in a chorus of agreement. "He's right," one shouted. "This is a life at stake," another added. The growing support seemed to unnerve Harris, but he held his ground. "This is my plane, and I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on board," Harris said, his tone hardening. "We're proceeding to our destination as planned." Daniel's voice turned cold, his words deliberate. "Then let me make this clear, Captain. If my wife dies because of your inaction, you will not only lose your job, you'll face the consequences of negligence. The entire cabin will testify to your indifference." Harris glanced around, suddenly aware of the sea of eyes fixed on him. The passengers were no longer silent observers, they were allies. Some nodded in agreement, others muttered their discontent, but the message was clear. The cabin was united against his inaction. The captain faltered, his authority cracking under the weight of their judgment. Finally he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine. I'll contact the nearest airport and request an emergency landing," he said begrudgingly. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, and Daniel returned to Rachel's side. He adjusted the oxygen mask and whispered, "We're almost there, Rachel. Just hold on a little longer." As the plane began its descent, the passengers watched Daniel with quiet admiration. In the face of indifference and bureaucracy, he had stood his ground. His unwavering determination had not only saved his wife's life, it had inspired everyone around him to stand for what was right. The plane's descent was steady but tense, every minute feeling like an eternity. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing at the nearest airport due to a medical situation on board. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." Daniel Turner sat rigid in his seat, holding Rachel's hand as her breathing remained shallow and labored. He kept one eye on the oxygen mask he had adjusted earlier and another on her pale face. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the only reassurance he had that she was still holding on. Around them, the cabin was eerily silent, save for the low hum of the engines and the occasional whispered prayer from concerned passengers. Rachel's condition was critical, and Daniel knew the moments before landing were crucial. He leaned close to her, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "Stay with me, Rachel," he whispered, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "We're almost there. Just hold on." The plane touched down with a jarring thud, the force momentarily jolting Rachel, Daniel's heart raced as he watched her eyes flutter open, a flicker of awareness returning. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. There was still much to do. Outside, emergency vehicles were already lining the tarmac, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. As soon as the plane came to a halt, the cabin doors opened, and paramedics rushed on board with a stretcher and advanced medical equipment. Daniel rose immediately, his hand still clutching Rachel's. "She's showing signs of cardiac distress," he informed the paramedics in a clipped professional tone. "Her pulse is weak, and her breathing has been labored for the past hour. She needs immediate intervention." The lead paramedic, recognizing Daniel's authority, nodded briskly. "We've got it from here, doctor. Let's stabilize her and get her to the hospital." "No," Daniel said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm coming with her. She needs someone who knows her medical history, and I won't leave her side." The paramedics exchanged a glance but quickly agreed, sensing the gravity of the situation. They carefully transferred Rachel onto the stretcher, Daniel remaining at her side, his hand never letting go of hers. As they moved through the cabin, passengers looked on in silence, their expressions a mixture of concern and admiration. A middle-aged woman reached out to touch Daniel's arm as he passed. "You're a good man," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "She's lucky to have you." Daniel nodded in acknowledgement, his focus entirely on Rachel. Every step down the aisle felt like a small victory, a testament to his refusal to give up, even when the odds were against them. The murmurs of encouragement from the passengers followed him, their quiet support a balm to his frayed nerves. The paramedics swiftly loaded Rachel into the waiting ambulance, Daniel climbing in beside her. As the doors closed, shutting out the chaotic scene of the tarmac, Daniel leaned close to Rachel. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We made it. Just hold on a little longer." The ambulance sped toward the hospital, its sirens piercing the night. Daniel monitored Rachel's vitals alongside the paramedics, his years of medical training keeping him focused despite the emotional weight of the situation. When they finally arrived at the emergency room, a team of doctors was waiting, ready to take over. As the doctors ran the suture instruments at the forearms and the back, Michael looked up at the ceiling in the corridor. Daniel hesitated for a moment as they wheeled Rachel away, the sight of her disappearing down the corridor leaving him feeling both helpless and hopeful. He slumped into a chair in the waiting room, his head in his hands, replaying every moment of the flight in his mind. Had he done enough? Had he made the right decisions? Hours later, a doctor emerged, his expression calm but reassuring. "Dr. Turner," he said, "you got her here just in time. She suffered a myocardial infarction, but we've stabilized her, and she's responding well to treatment." Relief crashed over Daniel like a wave. He followed the doctor to Rachel's room, his steps quick and purposeful. When he saw her lying in the bed, her face still pale but peaceful, the steady beep of the heart monitor was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Daniel approached her slowly, taking her hand in his. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a faint smile. "You didn't give up on me," she whispered weakly. "Never," Daniel replied, his voice breaking. "I promised I'd keep you safe." The next morning, as word of the incident spread, passengers began sharing their accounts on social media, praising Daniel's courage and determination. What started as a life-threatening ordeal had turned into a story of resilience and love, one that left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. For Daniel, however, the only victory that mattered was seeing Rachel alive and on the road to recovery. The ordeal aboard the flight did not end when Rachel Turner was wheeled into the emergency room. For Daniel Turner, the moments that followed were just as critical as the emergency itself. While his wife was now on the path to recovery, the events on that plane left a lingering question. How could an airline, entrusted with the safety of its passengers, fail so profoundly during a life-threatening emergency? As news of the incident spread, the passengers' accounts flooded social media. Posts described Daniel's unwavering courage, Rachel's harrowing condition, and the captain's cold indifference. Comments ranged from outrage to admiration, with hashtags like "Passenger Lives Matter" and "Medical Emergencies First" trending within hours. Major news outlets picked up the story, turning a private tragedy into a national discussion. The public demanded answers, and so did Daniel. Sitting across from the airline's representatives a week later, he made his position clear. "I'm not here for compensation," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This isn't about money. It's about ensuring no one else has to go through what my wife and I endured." The airline's representatives listened intently as Daniel outlined his demands. 1. Mandatory medical training for all flight crew members, including how to recognize and respond to cardiac emergencies. 2. Enhanced onboard medical kits equipped to handle life-threatening situations. 3. A review of emergency protocols, prioritizing passenger safety over operational convenience. The lack of action and empathy we experience is not just a failure of one individual, Daniel continued. It's a systemic issue, a failure of training, resources, and prioritization. This needs to change. Under mounting public pressure, the airline was forced to act swiftly. In a public statement, their CEO acknowledged the incident and announced immediate reforms. "We deeply regret the distress caused to the Turner family and the passengers aboard the flight," he said. "Effective immediately, all our flight crew will undergo advanced medical training and our aircraft will be equipped with expanded medical kits. Furthermore, Captain Richard Harris is no longer employed by our airline. His actions do not align with our values or commitment to passenger safety." The announcement marked a turning point, but for Daniel, the fight wasn't over. He became a vocal advocate for passenger rights, leveraging his platform as a respected doctor to push for broader industry changes. Appearing on national news programs and medical panels, he shared his experience, urging airlines to prioritize humanity over rigid procedures. "This isn't just about my wife or our flight," Daniel explained in one interview. "Every day, people board planes, trusting the crew to ensure their safety. That trust was broken, and it's up to all of us to demand better." The story struck a chord with the public. Advocacy groups rallied behind Daniel, using his case as a catalyst to demand stricter regulations for airlines. Within months, new federal guidelines were introduced, requiring airlines to equip every plane with defibrillators and advanced medical tools, provide ongoing medical training for all flight crews, implement stricter accountability measures for captains during medical emergencies. Meanwhile, Rachel, now recovering at home, reflected on the incident with gratitude and determination. "I'm alive today because my husband refused to give up on me," she said in a heartfelt statement. "But I also know how lucky I am. What happens to the passengers who don't have someone like Daniel fighting for them? That's what keeps me awake at night." The Turner's story became a rallying cry for change, inspiring countless others to speak out about their own experiences. It also shifted public perceptions of the airline industry, forcing companies to reevaluate their priorities and take a closer look at the human cost of neglect. For the passengers on that fateful flight, the events were a sobering reminder of what can happen when people stand together. Many wrote to the Turners, thanking them for their bravery and resolve. One passenger summed it up best in a letter. "You didn't just save Rachel's life, you showed all of us what it means to fight for what's right." In the end, Daniel's unyielding determination did more than save his wife. It ignited a movement, proving that even in the most desperate circumstances, one person's courage can inspire change that ripples far beyond the moment. The story of Daniel and Rachel Turner is a powerful testament to the strength of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the courage it takes to stand up for what is right, even in the face of indifference. It's a reminder that, in moments of crisis, determination and unity can challenge the status quo and create lasting change. Daniel's unwavering resolve saved his wife's life, but his actions went beyond a single flight. He held an entire industry accountable, ensuring that others would never face the same neglect and indifference. His fight wasn't just for Rachel, it was for every passenger who boards a plane trusting in the promise of safety and care. His advocacy turned a personal ordeal into a movement that redefined the standards for emergency response in the skies. Rachel's quiet strength throughout the ordeal is equally inspiring. Even as she faced life-threatening circumstances, she remained a symbol of resilience, a reminder of how deeply societal biases can affect us, but also how we can overcome them when supported by those who refuse to accept injustice. This story asks us to reflect on our own lives and actions. What would you do in a moment of crisis? Would you have the courage to stand up, even when faced with opposition? And how can we, as individuals and as a society, push for systems that prioritize humanity over convenience? As you consider these questions, we invite you to take action. Share this story with others, because awareness is the first step toward change. Advocate for better policies in your own communities, whether it's in the workplace, schools, or public services. And most importantly, stand firm in your beliefs when faced with situations where the right thing isn't the easy thing. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and justice. Together, we can amplify voices that challenge the norm and inspire change. What are your thoughts on Daniel and Rachel's journey? Have you ever witnessed or been part of a moment where standing up for what's right made all the difference? Share your reflections in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going and continue working toward a more just and compassionate world.